Right, so basically, I thought I'd record a video about my last book because I did videos for my previous three books. So the latest book I've written is called Collected Essays Volume Two, which is obviously a sequel to Collected Essays. And I've written 6 books so far, and I'm 32 now, and I've written 6 books, all unpublished. Probably with good reason. I've not sent them to publishers, but yeah, I've written 6 books. Confronting Reality was the first collection of short stories. Accepting Reality, second collection of short stories. Then I wrote a novel called Planet Jelenier. Then I wrote collected essays and a short story collection about historical characters called 15 Characters, known as an altruist. And now this collected essays volume 2. And most of my videos are unscripted, and they're not very good because I just kind of ramble and go off on these digressions, and they're not very structured. Although my scripted videos are a lot better, like all the videos called Tennis Connections, though they got fewer views than some of these crappy unstructured ones. But never mind. Anyway, let's make a start on this. I've got no notes. I'm just going to talk about this last book. So, Collected Essays Volume 2 is a collection of essays about many different topics. Because basically, I'm interested in a lot of different things. And I'm not very focused. I kind of am all over the place. I'm interested in... Main interest probably the arts, like, literature, film, music, that kind of thing. But I like making connections between these disparate ideas. This is what I did in the first volume, and this is what I've done in the second volume. Although in this second volume, they're a lot longer. The essays are a lot longer. The longest one is 12,000 words. So basically, so the first one is called Liberty, Equality and Fraternity, the Ideals of the French Revolution in Krzysztof Kieślowski's Three Colors trilogy. And Kieślowski is a director I like a lot, and basically made a lot of films in communist Poland, and then he did films in France, like Double Life of Veronique, and then this one called the first one's called Blue, the second one's called White, and the third one's called Red, obviously after the colours of the French flag. So basically, I try to make. I look at it's really long. It's 9,000 words, and I look at the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and I look at what some political philosophers have to say about those values, and do analyses of scenes in the 3 films. So I start off with liberty, and I look at Isaiah Berlin's distinction between positive and negative liberty. So negative liberty is absence from interference. So basically, negative liberty is when you're left alone to do whatever you want to do. So there's positive liberty is intervening to provide resources to allow for freedom. And so negative liberty is stuff like free speech, and positive liberty is something like like social insurance or health insurance or the NHS. It's that's positive liberty, as I said. When negative liberty is like freedom of speech and so on. And so I look at Isaiah Berlin, and I use that distinction, and I look at the films. I look at Blue, and I do analyses of Blue. Basically, she removes herself from society, and she lives alone for a while, and then she finishes a piece of music by her late husband who has died, and basically she connects to a higher political ideal by writing that piece to the European Union. And then I look at equality. Is the second one called White, and I look at John Rawls. So Rawls was another like Isaiah Berlin was like another liberal thinker, and he had this idea, this thought experiment called the veil of ignorance, in which he has two principles for the society of amnesiacs. The first one is everyone should every. The first one is the principle of liberty, but this he calls it equal liberty. So everyone should have access to liberty for everyone, basically. And the second principle is social and economic inequalities should benefit people in the lowest echelons of society, and they should be open to fair equality of opportunity. And I use that and I look at scenes in White because the character has more opportunities in the capitalist West than he does in the Soviet Union, where everything's completely leveled out, and he does it by abusing the system as well, which is quite interesting. Abusing the capitalist system because he finds he's like a bit like all these oligarchs in Russia after the collapse of communism, just happened to be at the right place at the right time and just stumbled into all this wealth. And basically, he also ends up homeless. So in that case, homelessness is the case in the Rawls' second principle that that inequality does not work. I mean, homelessness, it's not benefiting him, and he happens to be in the lower sections of society at that point. And then I look at a socialist thinker called R.H. Tawney, in the socialist and maybe in more of a British sense. And he wrote books called Equality and the Acquisitive Society. But basically, he argues that society. He basically argued in favor of what now is the NHS, of public health and public school. Basically, the majority at the time when this was the early 20th century, the majority of people lived in pretty torrid conditions. And he also writes. This is what I mentioned earlier. Is that there should be. Tony says that there should be some social rules to prevent people from abusing the system, and Carroll in White does abuse the system to get very wealthy. He does not. It's not. And then I look at Red, and people say like solidarity and fraternity is talked about a lot less than values like freedom and equality. But I look at another liberal thinker called Martha Nussbaum, where she writes briefly about fraternity in a book, The Fragility of Goodness. And but then I also look at this interesting anti-communist liberal philosopher called Leszek Kolakowski, and he argued that he would prefer a very greedy, competitive society than one in which fraternity and the equality, the brotherhood of man, when that was compulsory. He calls it like compulsory fraternity. And but then he writes somewhere else that it'd be a pity if we were to lose the socialist ideal, because not as a system. He argues that as a system, it's been catastrophic and one of the most evil ideas ever devised. But then he argues that it is useful in some sense as like solidarity with the underdog and against oppression and that kind of thing. So basically, I look at Red how there is some sense of fraternal bonding, but it is done by by individuals, and it is not coerced or enforced, And then the second essay has the horrible title. It's so long and convoluted. It's Perpetual Flux and Unchanging Singularity, the the ideas of Heraclitus and Parmenides in William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury and Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. It's like something from Monty Python, And basically, they're two pre-Socratic philosophers. And, philosophy starts with the pre-Socratics. Like the whole of Western knowledge starts with the pre-Socratics. And I look at Heraclitus and I look at Parmenides. And Heraclitus argued, they were both like polar opposites. Like Heraclitus argued that everything changes all the time. There's that famous quote, you can never step into the same river twice. And he called that the perpetual flux. Whereas Parmenides argued the opposite. He said everything is constant and everything is what he calls like unchanging singularity. So nothing changes, everything is in a state of stasis. So basically I use that and I look at two works of literature in which the first of which is The Sound of the Fury by William Faulkner, in which a lot happens all the time and everything constantly changes. And I look at the work of literature in which the opposite is the case, Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. And basically, William Faulkner, The Sound of the Fury is a great book, great novel. When you first start reading it, you just don't know what the fuck is going on, but it's just a brilliant piece of work. The first chapter jumps about all the time. It's not linear. It jumps about in time because the character has learning difficulties. He's cognitively impaired. And the character's called Benji, and it's kind of like it's like a temporal flux in which everything is constantly changing. And the second chapter is narrated by Quentin, a Harvard student, and he has a mental breakdown, and the syntax and the language kind of deteriorates and becomes this kind of stream of consciousness. And the language attempts to capture his mental breakdown. And the third chapter is by a character called Jason. And Jason is a very unpleasant man, and he's racist and he's sexist, and he's chasing his daughter Quentin, which is quite confusing because she has the same name as his brother Quentin. And the fourth chapter is in third person and narrates these characters going to the church, and they take Benji there. The title is derived from William Shakespeare's famous line from Macbeth: "Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." And basically, and the other thing I look at in Heraclitus and Faulkner is how these clashing opposites create how everything, the whole of nature, is the result of these clashing opposites, which kind of amalgamate and form something new. And I look at how the three brothers are these three opposites, but they come together to form something. And as I said, I look at Heraclitus. I use Heraclitus for that because that novel is always changing, like spasmodically all the time. It changes. It's endless. As I said, when you start reading it, you don't know what you're reading. It only makes sense once you finish the book, what you've read, And then then Parmenides. I look at Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, and there's a sense of that they always get together and they always wait for Godot, and they often talk about how they kind of nothing ever happens. It's kind of a sense of stasis. So I use Parmenides for that. And then the longest essay in the book is called Social Change in the HEIMAT Trilogy, which is basically, it's this 12,000 word essay in which I combine the social history of Germany in the 20th century and HEIMAT. And HEIMAT's great films. These are a series of films made for television. The first series lasts from 1919 until 1984, and the second one is longer, but it lasts for 10 years. It lasts from 1960 until 1970, and the third one is shorter than the first two, and lasts from 1990 until 2000. And the first series, I look at how the Nazification of German society, and I look at some scenes in the film, and then I look at the denazification of German society after the Second World War. And again, I look at scenes in the film. Basically, I look at some scenes and I describe how some of the characters use Nazism as a way in which to further their own careers and goals. They don't really believe in it as, like as a set of principles or as an ideology. It's just it's something that they use to advance their own careers. And then then I look at the denazification of German society, and I look at how they, it's just a bit of a whim. They kind of give up on it really easily. And then I look at the post-war economic miracle, where Germany grew in the 1950s by about 8% every year, something like that. I don't know I can't, off the top of my head, I can't give you the precise figure, but it grew a lot, and it was basically more of a market economy, whereas East Germany was a centrally planned economy, which obviously didn't work because central planning doesn't work. And I look at some scenes in the film. Again, I do like these analyses of certain scenes, and a character starts his own optic company, and he captures like the entrepreneurial spirit in post-war Germany. And his later on in the film, in some striking scenes, they try to buy him out. These multinational companies. So basically, I look how in the 1970s we get the rise of maybe a bit more of a predatory sort of capitalism, in which these multinational companies buy out these smaller local businesses. After the fall of Bretton Woods and all that, when exchange rates were fixed. And basically, he turns them down and he says, no, I'd rather not sell off my company. And basically, his company is more of a genuine company, and it offers something distinct and unique, whereas the multinationals just like these large, big, monolithic companies. And then I look at HEIMAT 2, which is probably my favorite one of all the series. It's a lot longer, and it's about these characters who are artists and intellectuals and bohemians, philosophers, activists, and I think it captures a sense of excitement you have, well, at least when I had when I was young. I mean, a bit older now, but when I was in my early 20s, that sense of the whole world opening up and being interested in ideas and art, it captures that sense of excitement. And the character Herman leaves Schabach, where the first series is set, and he's interested in music and he wants to be a composer. And it shows the burgeoning avant-garde music scene. And I look at avant-garde movements in music and film, and I look at how the series recreates it. Like, I look at Darmstadt in the 1950s and Munich. Darmstadt, and and how they create like people like Stockhausen created these electronic studios, and the series shows Herman, the main character, with his own electronic studio. And there's also, I look at the German New Wave, and I look at how the film recreates the German the German New Wave. And then I look at political radicalism, left wing political radicalism, and I look at the Red Army faction, and some of the characters. Initially, she's a poet, but then Helga becomes radicalized and she becomes a terrorist. And there's a lot of the German left in the 1960s distrusted the government, the Christian Democrat government, because they thought, it's all these Nazis are leading us, and the film recreates their descent into terrorism and radicalism. And then I look at HEIMAT 3. Basically, the first HEIMAT is more rooted in a local community, and it's a more homogenous community, whilst the second one is all about, youthful radicalism and leaving your home and finding your home as an adult. I think that's the theme of the second one. But the third one shows how homeland, because Heimat means homeland, it shows how homeland is more globalized, diverse, maybe more consumerist and more wealthy and more multicultural. Whereas the first series, as I said, is a homogenous community, and they vote in the Nazis. And I look at certain scenes and examine how, for the most part, the film shows that multiculturalism is quite successful, and there's harmony and there's a sense of solidarity. But there's other scenes in which the immigrants don't adapt very well to Germany. And I also look at the unification of East and West Germany, and I look at some German immigrants, some East German immigrants, after the collapse of communism, and basically Herman and Clarissa have them build a house for them in Schabach, but basically how they get exploited. And likewise, like a lot of the immigrants, a lot of the East Germans struggle to integrate into the new reunified Germany. So as I said, that's a 12,000 word essay, and it's really long. And then for the fourth one, I look at eccentric musicians. And I mentioned, I look a bit of music in the HEIMAT essay. I look at the avant-garde movements in post-war Europe, in Germany, and here I look at predominantly avant-garde musicians, because I really quite like experimental music. Something about it that I quite like. And these are all eccentric musicians with eccentric personalities who write eccentric music. And I start off with how authenticity has been written about in philosophy since antiquity. And I look at John Stuart Mill, whose book on liberty, the second chapter is all about a defense of free speech. And the third chapter is about individuality, and he writes how, about the cultivation of individuality, and he writes in that chapter how eccentricity is a virtue. And I think there's a famous quote from that chapter where he says the fact that so few people dare to be eccentric is the chief danger of the times. He wrote that in the 19th century, mind you, when it was a bit, society was a bit more moralistic, puritanical, homogenous. But nevertheless, I use a lot of John Stuart Mill at the start of that essay, and I look at 6 musicians. So I start off with Captain Beefheart, what I look at is I look at the personalities of these musicians, and I look at how their music is distinct, what makes their music unique. So Captain Beefheart his music's very interesting. I mean, it sounds chaotic at first, but the more you listen to it, the more you like it. How all these jagged, angular parts kind of flit off into separate places, and sometimes coalesce, and sometimes they don't. And the drumming's irregular and polyrhythmic, and the bass plays chords and is a voice in its own right. It's kind of very polymetric, multiple time signatures. And Beefheart's lyrics are kind of surreal, funny, absurd. And then I look at Captain Beefheart's great friend and nemesis, Frank Zappa, and they used to listen to rhythm and blues records when they were teenagers. And Frank Zappa, he was incredible. I mean, he first got into music when he was about 15, when he heard an Edgar Varese album. He really liked a piece called Ionization and Octandra, and he wanted to be a modern classical composer. But then he started a career in a rock band because he couldn't get his pieces performed as a composer, so he started a rock band. And his music, he did jazz, he did big band jazz, he did jazz fusion, he did satirical rock songs. His mind was quite dirty, and he wrote songs with sexual lyrics and comedy songs. And he was quite commercially successful because in the 1970s his albums sold a large quantity, and he was very well known. And later he did some pieces for orchestra, and then later after that some pieces for a computer synthesizer for computer music. And I look at what makes his music distinctive, and then I look at Marky Smith of The Fall. Captain Beefheart was not like musically literate, he didn't know anything about music theory, and the same is true for Marky Smith. He formed The Fall, which is named after a novel by Albert Camus, after seeing the Sex Pistols live, and it was kind of punk aesthetic The Fall had. But the lyrics are quite well thought out, and the music is kind of primitive. These guitar, which is not very well tuned, and playing maybe like 3 or 4 chords, and the drumming is kind of basic. But there's something kind of quite compelling about The Fall. And Marky Smith was very eccentric, and like Beefheart and to some degree Zappa, he was a bit of a tyrant, and he bullied his own musicians. This is a common theme for many of these eccentric musicians, that they were bullies. And they made more or less an album every year from 1979 until his death in 2018. And I look at what makes The Fall unique. And then I look at Sun Ra. And Sun Ra was very strange. And he claimed that he came from planet Saturn. So he came from Saturn, not from planet Earth. And he developed this kind of kitsch, mystical belief system. But his music, he started off with a big band, like a jazz band, and they played kind of swing, but it still had a distinctive style. But then he veered towards kind of freer jazz, and he produced some of the most noisiest and screechy examples of free jazz. And in many ways, Yeah, he's very unique, and I look at how he was a bit of a bully. He was a complete bully. He was as bad as Captain Beefheart in many ways. He kind of kept his house banned in a house arrest. He had these strict rules. And then I look at kind of more of a classical composer called Harry Parch. And Harry Parch, I look at his personality and how he liked being a hobo. And I look at how he was dissatisfied with something called equal temperament, because classical music has 12 tones per octave. It's been meddled with, and he wanted to explore smaller and smaller tones between between each key in each octave, and he called that microtones. But because you can't play microtones on conventional instruments, he had to build his own instruments, and they were beautiful to look at. And he wrote, his music was quite influenced by the Orient, by China, and antiquity as well. And his performances were incredible to look at. They're kind of like, he called them like a pagan ritual. And he also, I look at his eccentric personality, as I said earlier, like being a hobo. And then I look at Morton Feldman, who wrote very quiet, minimalistic music in which not much happens, And his pieces could go on for about, the most extreme example is String Quartet No. 2, which lasts for 6 hours. And Piano String Quartet is a beautiful piece of music. And I look at his eccentric personalities. Basically, I conclude the essay by saying that John Stuart Mill would have appreciated all of their eccentricities. And then I look at I have an essay called Nascent Liberalism in Antiquity and the Medieval Ages. And liberalism emerged in the 18th century during the Enlightenment. And it put a lot of emphasis on the individual. And it was against authoritarianism. And earlier societies were a lot more authoritarian and communitarian, a lot more emphasis on community than the individual. Basically, I wanted to look at antiquity, and I wanted to look at medieval ages, and I wanted to look at some figures who might not necessarily be liberals, but they do show signs of kind of like a nascent liberalism. And I start off antiquity by looking at, I start off by looking at Marcus Aurelius, who was, a Roman emperor. I look at Cicero and another Roman statesman. And I look at Diogenes, an extremely eccentric philosopher. And I look at Pericles, the Greek leader and statesman. And I look at how they show signs of nascent liberalism. So Cicero has this kind of defense of property rights and how property should belong to individuals. And individuals shouldn't be used as means to an end to justify some sort of pattern. And that's very, that sounds just like something that Robert Nozick would write in Anarchy, State and Utopia. And that was a big influence on Kant, the idea of means, not people being ends in themselves rather than as means to a particular goal. But then he's still not a full-on liberal, because he says you find your worth as being a member of a community. And Marcus Aurelius, again, it's mostly about community, but there is a particular passage in his book Meditations in which he argues that the primary goal of government is to protect the freedom of its citizens, which is something that Spinoza could have written in much later on. And Diogenes was an extremely eccentric character. he wasn't really a philosopher. He was kind of like this stunt art. I don't know what to call him. And he argued that again, this was very radical in antiquity. Saying that you should go against the current and you should be yourself and you should find your true worth and all that kind of stuff. It's a bit of a cliche now, but it was quite radical in antiquity. Don't follow the herd. Don't go against the crowd. That kind of thing. Something that integral to who I am. And he did all sorts of masturbated in public. And in Greece, there was this distinction between public and domestic spheres. Not between public and private spheres. So again, that was very radical behavior. And then I look at Pericles, was a Greek leader, and I mean, democracy is not necessarily like a liberal value, or not necessarily. The liberalism and democracy have since been fused together. But initially, liberals were very skeptical of democracy because it might lead to mob rule, and the founders of the American Constitution was suspicious of Pericles because but still, I mean, he increased democracy, something that was started with Solon, but then Pisistratus came in and rolled it back. But then I think there's a guy called Clisthenes who made Athens a democracy. And Pericles took it further because he made government more accountable and transparent. And I mean, he was definitely defended the values of freedom and equality, which are liberal values. And then I look at medieval ages, and basically, I'll use a guy called Larry Sidentop a lot, who wrote this book called Inventing the Individual. And Sidentop argues in that book that Christianity is an individualistic religion. And I look at a guy called St. Augustine, and it started off as kind of St. Paul, that the individual finds salvation through Christ. And then I look at St. Augustine, and he's all about inwardness and choice. And then much later on, I look at Thomas Aquinas, who wrote a lot about autonomy and how the individual directs his own actions. But this was very much something that is determined by God. They always write about God and divinity, whereas the Enlightenment, tried to separate, especially like someone like Spinoza. He tried to see, he did believe in God, but it was kind of like pantheistic. And he's trying to see nature as something divorced from supernatural causation. But the medieval fathers, like Thomas Aquinas and so on, definitely do believe in the supernatural, and they do write about God a lot. And I do include historical bits about medieval culture and ancient culture. Okay, and then I have an essay called The Very Brief History of Dream Interpretation, which is the shortest essay in the book. It's 3,000 words. And it's just like it does what it says on the tin. It's a very brief history of dream interpretation. So again, like I look at ancient Greece, and there's like a dream guidebook, and it is by a guy called Artemidorus, and it has the same title as Freud's book. It's called Interpretation of Dreams. But basically, the Greeks did think, and the medieval ages did think that dreams were kind of like supernatural interventions. Though the ancients did have this notion that dreams come out of your own head. In some cases, though, the medieval didn't think this at all. They thought it was completely supernatural. So I look at antiquity, and I look at medieval ages, and then I have a bit about Freud, who basically argued that you obviously have that all that stuff about the unconscious, and how dreams reveal the unconscious, and how the unconscious underpins all our actions, and how dreams are prophetic. And there are some echoes of antiquity in this, because I look at the Odyssey and in Home. I look at Homer and the Odyssey, and that has a lot about prophetic dreams. And Freud is an atheist, and he sees there's nothing kind of supernatural about this. And then I look at neuroscience, and basically there's no confirmation of anything that Freud said in neuroscience. And I look at, how neurons connect and all that, and how dreams come about. Okay, so then there's that one, and then there's the seventh one is an essay called "Economic Decline in the Cinema of the 1970s." And I look at the economic history of the 1970s, and I look at new Hollywood films. I look at four films. They are Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese, Blue Collar by Paul Schrader, Being There by Hal Ashby, and Life of Brian by Monty Python, directed by Terry Jones, I believe. And I provide like a brief history of the 1970s and how everything, how it led to stagflation. There were problems. These problems started in the late 60s, but a lot of it was accentuated by the oil crisis. It's kind of like the end of Keynesianism, and I look at the history of that, and then look at how it comes through in these four films. So there's a sense of economic stagnation and being there. They all talk about how we're in this recession, and it's very simple-minded characters perceived as being this political philosopher. He'd call Chance, and he talks about the seasons and about there will be growth in the spring, and this is interpreted as a very optimistic view of the economy. And then there's I look at Monty Python's Life of Brian, and I look at how the kind of left-wing sectarianism is depicted by like the Romans people, the Judea's People Front, and the People's Front of Judea, and I look at how the trade unionism and the left-wing sectarianism paralyzed the British economy in 1979 with the winter of discontent. And then I look at Taxi Driver, and I look at the stagnation of New York. And the character Travis Bickle, talks about the garbage in the streets. There's scenes of child prostitution. And I look at how that comes through in that film. And then look at Blue Collar, and I look at corrupt American trade unions in the States, and how that comes through in Blue Collar by Paul Schrader, and how he depicts these corrupt trade unions. The final essay is about literature. It's called Imaginary Worlds in Latin American Fiction. And I really like a lot of Latin American authors. So Latin America became kind of this literary sensation in the 1960s and the 1970s when it sold a lot of copies. Especially the most famous example is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I look at five authors. I look at Jorge Luis Borges. I look at Julio Cortázar. I look at Juan Carlos Onetti. I look at Pedro Páramo. Juan Rulfo. I look at Juan Rulfo. And I look at José Donoso. So I look at how they create these strange, parallel, imaginative worlds. So Borges has a story about a sphere that contains an entire universe, about a man dreaming another man in a circular temple, about creating his organs and his body, plot about a planet of ideas. I look at Cortázar, how a man looks at a fish and becomes a fish. And then Borges, and Donoso is a strange one. This Castle of Mutants, this parallel Castle of Mutants. Onetti, basically, and Rulfo about how all these characters are dead in this ghost town. So basically, I look at those novels and how they create these imaginary worlds. Okay, so those are all the essays, and the essays were a lot longer than the first volume of collected essays, and yeah, that's the end of the video. Thank you.